Welcome back to my channel. I am your narrator, Ahi, and today's story is a more common one, a more popular one. This story goes all the way back to a time when our cultural ancestors, the Tainos, first met the conquistadors. This is the legend of the Golden Table. Chief Xoquetza stood in full ceremonial dress, awaiting the arrival of his guests. He wore the fan-shaped headdress that marked his rank. He was naked, apart from a feathered skirt and a fine long feathered cloak fastened at the neck. In his hand, he held a beautifully carved wooden staff of office he had made a fine sight, his brown skin shining in the bright sunlight. When they were told of the approaching newcomers, the people of this Arawak village had all turned out to satisfy their curiosity. Nearly naked men, women, and children milled around in ever-increasing excitement as the time approached to entertain the guests from across the sea. They were a naive people, trusting and hospitable, so they had spent the day preparing a feast, laying it on a large table made of solid gold, which stood in the center of the village clearing. 6 visitors emerged from the bush. It was some 2 years since Columbus had set foot on Jamaica soil, and the Spanish were about their business of occupation and rape. All such activity was usually preceded by smiling faces and forked tongues. So such a greeting was offered as they entered the clearing. The group consisted of soldiers carrying muskets and pikes sloped across their shoulders, not intending to attack because they had been informed that this particular tribe was likely to be peaceful. Indeed they were, for as the chief raised his hand in greeting, the men of the tribe gathered around, touching the strange garments and weaponry, whilst the women showed a special interest in the facial hair of the newcomers. Communicating in signs and gestures, both sides sought to satisfy their curiosity, but the Spaniards certainly knew what was being conveyed when the chief pointed to his mouth, then to the food laid on table. The feast began, but it didn't take long for Xoquetza to realize that his guests seemed to be more interested in the table than the food. He noticed that they were making silent signals to one another as they pointed to and stroked the golden table. He was not aware of its value, it being for him only a metal object of great beauty, but it was obvious that the soldiers coveted this tribal heirloom. He kept his counsel and still treated the visitors with courtesy until the conquistadors returned to their encampment. The moment they were gone, the chief, to the amazement of his followers, had the golden table cleared, then removed to a place of hiding. This wily old fox had seen the greedy glint in the eyes of his guests and had anticipated their future actions. His prophecy was soon to be fulfilled, for only 2 days later, a small army, led by his previous visitors, entered and massacred his village, slaughtering without mercy the men, women, and innocent children. In the midst of this brutal havoc, Xoquetza was lashed to a tree to be witness to the genocide. Some of the children who were not butchered outright were strung up by their wrists to overhanging tree branches facing their chief. Search as they may, there was no sign of the golden table, so the silver-tongued devil who had first offered his Judas friendship to the chief now began a slow torture of his honorable host. He was skilled at his craft and inflicted appalling pain as he endeavored to ascertain the whereabouts of the coveted prize. But the more torment he administered, the more stubborn his victim became. But this torturer had a sudden inspiration, and giving a command to his men, turned attention to the hanging children. Dry wood and bracken was piled up under each other. Then the first was set alight, until the child was twisting and screaming in agony. This was too much for Xoquetza to bear, and he roared out in anguish for the child. The evil Spaniard knew that he had found the mark, so he cut the grieving chief down from the tree, shrugged his shoulders, and pointed to question the direction of travel to find the table. Xoquetza waved to be followed and staggered into the undergrowth. But no sooner had he left than the treacherous soldiers lit all of the fires, then followed behind, leaving the hanging children to burn to death. They all wound their way towards the river, a fast-running cataract that rushed between high cliffs, the party picking a careful way upwards along a precarious trail until it came upon a cave, high up in the steep rock face. The victim and his oppressor stepped into the dim light of the cavern, and as their eyes adjusted to the darkness, the golden prize stood before them. The Spaniard gesticulated to instruct his prisoner to bring the table to the cave mouth, and with one mighty heave, the heavy ceremonial furniture was hoisted to chest height. Turning to find his captor between himself and the exit, Xoquetza let out a bellow of triumph as he charged, sweeping the tyrant before him. They both careered out onto the ledge and the table. Arawak and soldier tumbled over and over, down into the raging torrent below. Whilst the trophy sank into the depths, the two men were swept away to a watery grave. The following day, a small group of soldiers returned equipped with rope and grappling hooks to dredge the river bottom for the precious artifact. But before they could commence their labor, the table floated to the surface. This hefty treasure rose up from the depths as soon as though it were made of cork, and sat quite still on the turbulent waters, glistening in the sunlight. For a moment, the Spaniards stood awestruck at this extraordinary spectacle, but the value of the booty soon brought them back to earth. Grappling irons were cast time after time until one lucky angler struck gold, and with a great whoop of triumph, they all took a firm hold of his line and began to heave. But the table wouldn't budge. They strained to greater effort when suddenly a guffaw of loud laughter rang from cliff to cliff. Turning towards interruption, the figure of a native man was seen standing at the mouth of the cave, wearing a fan-shaped headdress, a feathered skirt, and a long feathered cloak. And as he stood, arms outstretched, he carried a wooden staff in his left hand. My God! It was a duppy of Xoquetza, returned to protect the table of gold. The men were transfixed with terror. Then, without warning, the golden table sank back into the river, dragging the screaming soldiers into the wild, violent waters, never to be seen alive again. During the past 500 years since the incident, many brave souls have set out in search of the Arawak's gold, never to return. It is said that every day at noon, the table will rise to the surface of the rushing waters, sparkle in the sunlight, then sink once again, out of the reach of covetous hands. If it is your intention to seek this elusive treasure, be prepared for an encounter with Xoquetza, whose laughter can often be heard ringing across the valley to this very day. That's it for today's story. Thank you for listening. Like, share, and subscribe if you like the video and want to hear more. Bye-bye.